So welcome everybody. And if folks have questions from the attendees, uh, put them in the chat. Come on in the room. Let's join in with the panel and have a larger conversation. We're all friends at this point. Steve, again, just a terrific keynote this morning.
Thank you. Thanks. It was fun.
Thanks for kicking us off in the right direction. Such an inspiration to hear about People USA and how the program that you've developed over the years.
It's been quite the journey.
Were you able to see any of Amanda and Therese's presentation? How do you fit into their map? How does People USA fit in there?
Nicely. I think um how
Are you a CCBHC?
we're not, but we work with CCBHCs. The challenge for us with CCBHCs is that they don't all follow a fidelity model. And I think that's the
Hmm.
hardest part for us in fitting in to try to collaborate with them to help them to understand. I know in New York, a lot of them will tell us we have peers, in our CCBHC. Okay, what does that mean? And so it comes down to the definition and the roles and things like that. And then I'm one that will also look at the CCBHC and every role in a CCBHC and clarify that with them if they'll let me. Um, so that there is a good role clarification in how a CCBHC should run. The design of the model is great. It's just how you use it and how you avoid the paternal instincts that many CCBHCs have, still to this day.
It's, can I jump in, Jason?
Yeah.
Steve, super nice to meet you. Thank you for sharing those insights. Yeah, it's such a helpful kind of point to hear. I mean, something that I think was very intentional when they were designing the federal CCBHC criteria is that they're immensely broad. And what that means is that each organization gets to define them in the ways that makes the most sense for them and hopefully their local communities. And that is what we're seeing. They're taking in they're doing community needs assessments and so forth. But that's where the work that you're doing, really understanding the roles of each CCBHC, how they're defining them in practice beyond the criteria is so essential and really speaks to how local these conversations are because each organization is going to operationalize those criteria in different ways and then partner with their local communities and the providers in those communities in different ways as a response.
Yeah.
Another comment or question that came up during our presentation that we unfortunately didn't have a chance to address, and Steve, I'm wondering if you might have some insight on, but I guess mentioned the power dynamic between these types of institutions and programs and was curious about information on salary for peers versus clinicians. And I'm not familiar with that information, but also wanted to, give voice to that question. And I think maybe other folks here might be better able to answer it.
Yeah, the salaries for us, the salaries came into question pretty early on when we started our respite houses and things, and seeing the work that the staff do, seeing the work that clinicians do, the work that other programs do, and whatever, I would do a search in the community to see what the salaries were looking like, and could I, pay a livable wage to the teams, that I hire. We're going through this process now where we're looking at all the different salaries and we're doing for 4 quarters. Each quarter, we're going to have an increase in a group of staff that are not at the level that we would like to see them at. So behind that, you have to build the revenue, right? So that's why we're doing it quarterly, so we can build that revenue and afford it, not get ourselves in trouble as we raise those salaries. But we comparatively, we're one of the highest paid paying organizations, in our region that we know of. And it's not just peer, it's just, all agencies we look at. And so we try to remove that power dynamic, in that way.
Clay and Beethoven, you want to comment on pay differential for peer workers?
Yeah, for sure. And I want to step back to the CCBHC conversation a little bit too. So,
Hmm.
Cascadia Health is a CCBHC, and we're also an FQHC lookalike, federally qualified health center. And we've run into some weird, and we've not actually got any answers from anybody. We're having these conversations about billing in regards to that. Like our teams are on contract with the county right now, but there's this question of double dipping comes up a lot too. Like if and what I've been trying to bring to the conversation a lot too is like what's actually included in mobile crisis services, and like could we bill for all of our follow-up care separately and things like that. So I'd love to hear from y'all. I see Amanda and Steve shaking their heads. So hear some of that from y'all, but I will address the pay thing too real quick. And that's, you know, we really have had a lot of struggle with that, and our agency right now has started to look at job duties, and I've seen some movement in that direction. So, for instance, supervisors that have similar job duties but just require different credentials are paid much closer, but there's still some movement in that. When our staff unionized too, that I think was helpful, and there's been some compensation analysis that's gone on since then. But um, the peer run agencies in our town are actually the ones that have really pushed the needle up, which has been super helpful. So the peer company and Bridges to Change and a couple others in Portland, start $25 an hour flat rate, no matter what the position. And since we directly compete with them for staff, that's enabled me to like raise the bar a little bit too. So I really appreciate their work and advocacy.
So it's working with those outside advocates that helps that pay differential sort out. Sometimes you can't fight that battle inside alone. You need some outside folks to push. Amanda, Therese, have you found other FQHC, CCBHC combinations?
There are a few. I mean, they're not the dominant. So, Clay, I don't know if this was your story, but typically an organization was an FQHC and then they received their CCBHC designation. And so there aren't most organizations that become CCBHCs are what we think of as like outpatient providers of mental health services, primarily like a community mental health center. And we're seeing that a smaller subset of organizations are FQHCs and then they receive their designations. But we're hearing across the board, but particularly from those that are benefiting from the FQHC Medicaid payment as well as the CCBHC one, is how do you kind of figure out what goes in which PPS or which goes in which Medicaid? I'm trying not to use the technical language here, excuse me. Which goes in the which Medicaid payment, which one goes in the other Medicaid payment. And then for mobile, we're finding that it also really depends on the state context, and that a lot of CCBHCs are choosing not to put mobile into what are called the cost reports. And Clay, I know you're familiar with this, which are used to calculate the rates that Medicaid pays to these organizations because they're getting state dollars or other dollars to cover those services. And so I add that context because I think it speaks to kind of what Steve was getting at earlier as well, which is so much of this is based off of what's going on locally and within the state. And that there is by no means a universal way by which CCBHCs are billing for mobile services because of that context. And so we're trying to figure it out. But Clay, as you were speaking, I was just like nodding, being like, please, any insights you have as a CCBHC, FQHC providing these services, let me know.
It's tough. I feel like we're asking the same questions too. And, we work with, our funders at Multnomah County and with folks from Care Oregon, the Medicaid provider here. And I get a lot of questions back from them too. And I'm just like, aren't y'all supposed to have those answers? It's,
Yeah,
it's been, it's been a tough little circle back and forth.
Yeah,
yeah. And
I
it's
find that they really don't have answers. I know in New York, the thing I always will tell people in different states is look at your state plan amendment with Medicaid and what's in that? Do you have the 1115? Have you thrown everything you can possibly throw in there where the state can make that negotiation with Medicaid to accept, pieces of it? And New York's been okay at it, but nobody's perfect. But I think that's a big part of it. But if we could have a standardizing body like a federal mental health substance abuse kind of a leader come forward and say, let's start to look at our national systems and how can we start to create a fidelity model for billing, for services, for whatever. And I don't think we've ever had leadership that has taken that on. And that is something I would love to take on, as a public policy movement, so that, when we hear you've been to one state, you've been to one state, well, why are we okay with that? And I'm not okay with that. I'd love to go to any other state and have similar care and similar billing and similar, all the funding and whatever that is fair for the communities. And we're just, it's a big system we're dealing with. It's a very, obviously we're finding out a very corrupt system federally, and how do you beat that, and I don't give up, and I would never give up, but I think having the right leadership and the right common sense that can also show the evidence behind a lot of the work we do is not as expensive as they all presume it is. In fact, it could be cost savings. Um, to me, it's just ridiculous, when I do meet with the political world and we talk about this and how naive they are to what's being done, what's possible, and not just thinking of tradition, like we need more hospitals, we need more of this, we need more. No, no, we need a better business plan for behavioral health, and we have to do it together because we're the operators. We're the ones that get to see it on the ground. And if they would just listen and help us, help them design this, we could have a great system in our country.
Uh, yeah,
That's the
I
work
think
we need.
it needs to come from us. It
Yeah.
needs to come from us, and we need to use our skills, our talents in this group to create that business plan and put it forward. We're not going to get any action. Well, wait a second, Amanda, you are our federal whisperer. What what's the future of the CCBHC look like right now?
Oh, I mean, it's like a weird thing to say, but I mean, the Medicaid cuts are obviously going to really impact those organizations. Clay can speak, I think, very astutely to that would be my guess. But what's interesting about like CCBHC federal policy specifically is we're actually seeing kind of no threats to the growth of like the main federal program that is benefiting CCBHCs, which is something called the Section 223 Medicaid demonstration. But what we're also seeing on top of that is states pursuing other mechanisms to make CCBHCs permanent in their states outside of this federal demonstration, which is a temporary program. CCBHCs are not vulnerable to everything that is going on at the federal level. But when we think about CCBHC specific policy, it's actually an area where it seems like the feds aren't going to touch kind of the Medicaid initiatives that are specific to CCBHCs. I'll stop there.
It's March 3rd. On March 2nd,
Oh no,
2026.
don't hold me accountable. I mean, that is my, I should have
Department of
asterisked that
Justice and
entire
Department of
comment.
Labor released
Um,
their big grant announcements yesterday, and nothing about mobile crisis. Department of DOJ or DOL. Crisis
yeah,
stabilization, yes,
yeah.
but a
Which,
lot of access to hospitals. A lot of
yeah,
everybody's going to the hospital.
yeah. Which, I mean, it's interesting when we think about like sustainability and payment for mobile services and what is the role of Medicaid, I think is just like a larger question. Um, and because of the CCBHC Medicaid financing structure and the opportunity to incorporate mobile crisis into those rates, and those rates don't seem to be going away,
Hmm.
it might be one potential avenue to pursue. Again, I'm not trying to be a whisperer that that is the silver bullet. It seems like in the context of all these cuts that are going on, this seems to be an area that is going to be okay. And so it's worth kind of being thoughtful about that from from a sustainability perspective going forward.
So we talked about the difference between the community's response and the the public health response and the public safety response that Therese and Amanda are looking at. The public health response is being paid for largely through Medicaid dollars, but the public safety response is being paid for largely through city general fund. And is that part of the sustainability problem here? Yes? No?
Yeah, I mean, it is because they're not prepared for it. And again, it's not a lot of focus on designing it to work well, and when I say that, I think you're all familiar with sequential intercept mapping and community mapping and things like that. If you map your community, it kind of gives you a good picture of what your community needs, where the gaps are and where the problems are. If a local community were to take that on, they could benefit, from it if they invest in it. And that's the question is, will they invest in it? That's when you get back to the ignorance of our communities, because they just don't know. They don't know what you're talking about when you say a mobile team. They don't know what you mean by a stabilization center or, all these different things, a CCBHC, whatever. And you have to literally redundantly teach them before they even start to think about a decision. So there's such a learning curve, and a learning gap in trying to do this locally. And I think that's the task that many of us take on. We start to provide the service, whether the community knows it or not, and then we have to market it and say, "Look what we did! Look at the differences that we're making." Then you start to get that buy-in, but that takes so long to do. And just getting back to that, good leadership and understanding it's everywhere. So our messages have to be redundant and third grade level and help people to understand what could happen in their communities.
Got a friend of the show who wants to ask some questions. Come on in. Amir Chappell.
Hey, good afternoon, panelists. I'm thoroughly enjoying this discussion. I did have a couple of questions, one for Chelsea and one for Amanda and Therese. And, someone who values the power of data and the power of narratives to drive policy, I was curious about what you were talking about when you said the research on co-response models is limited and there's mixed, and then the CIT research on the law enforcement side, on those key outcomes like arrests and deaths by officers, it's kind of mixed. And I'm just thinking of myself, like Steve was saying, the political world's crazy. So if I'm a legislator sitting there hearing prominent researchers like yourselves saying that, this research mixed, it's limited, we don't really know. And me, as somebody from a marginalized community, I think of a civilian response model that I'm not aware of has not resulted in any deaths of any individuals that they've served, like civilian only. And I'm sure there may be, maybe not. I've never heard of it. And so, like, when a legislator hears that, it minimizes the impact of like an advocacy group's ability to effectively advocate for more money, for policy change, because they put a lot of stock in what you're saying. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts on like language that us as advocates can use when researchers are saying like, well, we really don't know, it's limited and it's mixed. So therefore, a legislator is like, you know what, well, then we can't go with it, we can't fund it. So is there any thoughts you have on how we can talk about that? That's just my first question for your study, because you said mental health calls for service 2015 to 2018 were identified as mental health by the officer. And we know that mental health calls for service are extremely hard to determine based on like the CAT, the computer aided dispatch data. So I was just wondering, like mental health calls are underrepresented in the data. We know there's a lot more. So just curious on how we can talk about that. So that's my first question.
Thank you so much that you shared a lot there. So I'll try my best to answer all of the pieces you brought up. First, starting with the research on the Seattle Police Department data from 2015 to 2018. So I shared that from those crisis incidents, that it was about 20,000 incidents during that period. So these are already incidents classified by SPD as being crisis incidents. And that means that At the close of the incident, the responding officer filled out what they called a crisis template to provide information on the nature of that incident. And of those, officers indicated that 78% of those crisis incidents were really nothing more than that. And then 22% involved some sort of often low level crime against persons, property, or society. So to that question, yes, it's identified by the officer. Of course, we have challenges in how we're capturing crisis incidents in the first place. Seattle has experienced an increase in crisis incidents over the years. And actually, now we're working on updated data from 2015 to 2025 to look at a more rigorous analysis of the impact of CIT, crisis intervention team training, on outcomes to do more of a causal design. Because what you mentioned is that I spoke about how the research on CIT and co-response is fairly limited, weak, or mixed findings. And these, what I'm talking about there, are specifically police-led or police-involved crisis response models. So when it comes to crisis intervention team training, where police officers are the sole responders and may have received this CIT certification, which is typically 40 hours of mental health training. The research in this space, it's been challenging to conduct because of just data limitations. And so it has been quite limited, but the findings show that it is not an evidence-based practice for improving outcomes related to arrest and use of force, although it has shown improving officer attitudes and knowledge and confidence in responding. But the research hasn't really been able to look at, well, does this impact the outcomes we care about? And then co-response, the research there, I'm less intimately familiar with that, but there was a recent rapid review, which I'll put in the chat, as well as some reviews on CIT I can share with you, which showed that the strength of this intervention in improving the outcomes, again, that we care about, is pretty limited and doesn't have a strong evidence base. Whereas for civilian or community responder programs, mobile crisis, as you said, we know that law enforcement kills individuals experiencing signs of mental illness at a high rate, and that these folks are at risk of death from law enforcement, whereas these programs limit that risk greatly. And so that is a strength, and a lot of our work is focused on building the evidence base in that space. So I'll share some of the articles I mentioned in the chat and hope I answered the pieces you asked for there.
Absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate it. And then just my real quick question for Chelsea, part of the crisis response are, community violence intervention kind of crisis response teams. Like in Oakland, the Department of Violence Prevention has the ceasefire and macro and all those things. And I was wondering, we may have noticed, at least I noticed during the discussion, I sometimes feel like it's hard for the crisis response in teams and programs that deal with individuals experiencing mental crisis, as opposed to like a crisis response team that responds to the scene of a shooting to engage, like, the people the victims of the shooting victim, or engage the person who's still alive and shot, and trying to intervene in that way. And the ERPOs, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on a way for just the average bigger body of the crisis response teams and programs, and how the peers can think about, because you said majority of the ERPOs are from law enforcement, like overwhelmingly they come from law enforcement. And sometimes there's this reluctance for a peer to say, you know what, I'm going to say this, I'll show up in court and I'll do all these things, because you just don't want anything to do with that. So is there anything you can help us think about as an average, responder, to kind of think about how we should engage ERPOs? Should we try to shift that away from law enforcement? I know there's the public safety piece of the firearm, but they're sending people out to shooting scenes in very marginalized communities that are civilians, credible messengers by themselves. And, it's dangerous, but, I was just wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, no, thank you for raising that. I appreciate that question really quite a bit. And I think, one of the things, and I come from the advocacy world, and when we are advocating for a policy, we tend to sell it loudly as a solution to many, many, many things. And I think the reality about extreme risk protection orders is that it is a narrow remedy for a narrow set of cases, right? And so there are certainly situations where it is not in the individual's best interests to involve law enforcement, period, full stop. And there's lots of reasons for that. So in those scenarios, we would not advocate for use of ERPO there. We wouldn't advocate for commencing a new court proceeding that will likely inevitably involve law enforcement and could lead down the road to some kind of criminal consequence. And so that's just the fact, and we don't advocate for that. On the other hand, I think that sometimes we make assumptions about which communities would be interested in learning about ERPO and which wouldn't. And I think we have done that in the CVI space quite a bit, where we just make an assumption of, CVI workers and people who are doing credible messenger work are not going to be people who are going to want to advocate for use of ERPO. Therefore, we're not going to reach out to provide, any kind of training or education about it. And that is a bad assumption, right? Like there are absolutely situations in which crisis intervention workers, CVI workers are going to, be negotiating a situation where actually getting one of these orders, either through a family member or maybe through involving law enforcement in a way that feels safe, is the right thing to do in that situation to remove the firearm. And so there's a lot more that I think we need to do to engage with the CVI community when it comes to providing information about ERPO in a way that isn't trying to oversell it as a solution to every kind of case, right? I think we should just be doing more to make information available about what it is, how it works, how you do it, and things to think about when you're deciding whether or not this intervention is appropriate in each particular case.
Thank you.
So Steve and Clay and Beethoven, do you see any ability for you to use extreme risk protection orders in your work? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. Strangely enough, we literally just had a presentation on ERPOs at our last team meeting for the crisis team. So we work really closely with the behavioral health units of both of the,
Yeah.
Portland and Gresham Police. And, I do think a police response regarding an ERPO from one of those bodies is very different from a police response from a regular officer or from regular officers. I also think ERPO can be really supportive to the family members in certain circumstances too. And, when we, respond to a crisis, we're considering everybody that's involved too. And oftentimes the support that we're providing is to a family member, too, and maybe helping them connect with these resources and stuff like that. But I do think that, again, like this is, when we talk about it in the news, it's presented sometimes as this like grand solution to things, and it is a very narrow set of circumstances where this comes up. And then even when it does, some of our law enforcement partners tell us often too that like this is not a guarantee of anything. So it's not a guarantee that the person can't get a firearm. So we also have to caution folks that like, yes, this could be a really supportive tool in a circumstance where we think someone's going to go buy another firearm or something like that. But in a lot of other circumstances, it's not really very helpful. An ERPA is not going to cause Portland police to go and search someone's home and tear it apart and find weapons and stuff like that. So I think yeah, it's a good tool in its context, but that context is very narrow for us.
Steve, any thoughts?
I would just say that we stay in our lane for the most part as a mobile team. People have different specialties. I don't ever want to jeopardize the teams. So we're not going to be the panacea to every situation, and we know that. And so the staff are making very smart decisions, when things like this do come up. And that we serve enough people out there that really need it and want it, and I don't want to, like I said, just jeopardize extending ourselves to say we're experts at everything, and we're just not.
Chelsea, why do you think it is that the CVI community didn't pick this idea up and run with it?
Well, I mean, two things. There's the hesitancy around working with law enforcement and the inherent lack of trust of law enforcement in a lot of communities. The other thing is ERPO is not going to be appropriate in a situation where the person in crisis who has access to firearms is not a lawful possessor of firearms. So if you have a criminal conviction that makes you prohibited from possessing firearms under either federal or state law, ERPO is not the right tool there. I mean, you are potentially jeopardizing somebody by bringing to the attention of law enforcement or a court that they are in fact violating the law by being in possession of firearms. And so those, I think, are the kind of two primary hesitancies around using ERPO in a CVI context.
And sorry to just drill down on this, but Clay, when you have an emergency client who has a gun illegally, what's your procedure?
It's a great question, and we don't have a set procedure for it. Again, I think everything's in the details. We would analyze the circumstances, talk to everybody that's involved, try to come up with the best course action that stays within our lane. But again, we would want to, I can't say there'd be a certain, one single, solution to that. There's so many variables there. I mean, I can say, we've talked folks into going in, pawning guns or to giving guns to family members, lots of different things. If somebody's concerned that they don't want law enforcement involved at all, but they're willing to, put that firearm in a safer location. But it's tough, it's also, you have to weigh the risk of drawing attention to those things as well, too. So,
Yeah, and to your point, Clay, there aren't always good options, particularly in states that have really strong gun safety laws, which are fantastic, laws that require background checks for transferring guns and things like that. It has the impact of reducing the number of available legal options for kind of temporarily transferring a firearm to a safer place sometimes. So, in addition to work on ERPO, we're working also on just trying to expand those options for people who, for whatever reason, maybe your grandchildren are visiting for the week and you just don't want to have the gun in your house, right? Or maybe there's a person in crisis, and you want to keep them safe from the firearm. There are a number of different reasons why somebody might want to temporarily put their firearm elsewhere. And so that's just another piece of kind of some of the work we're doing is, trying to find gun dealers who will, hold people's guns for a temporary amount of time and things like that. But it is, particularly when you're dealing with folks who may not be lawful gun owners, it gets really tricky. There are some police departments that have, that purport to have kind of immunity provisions where if you turn in a gun, they're not going to, you won't be prosecuted for anything related to it. I also know that folks don't always trust that either. So it's not an easy situation.
Yeah, I'll just say too, I really like Steve's comment on that too. And we try to stay in our lane. And I see our role, especially as peer providers and as mobile crisis folks, is to educate the community on their options. So we talk to a lot of families about those things you're talking about, Chelsea, about, safe in-home storage, about places that you can store your firearm out of the home, and things like that. And then empower folks to, make their own decisions about things. And when they do have specific questions about, the intricacies of the law and things like that, we have folks that we refer them to, and they can answer those questions better for them.
Let's shift our conversation. We've got Dr. Everett here for a few more minutes, and let's shift our conversation to what we are all looking at all the time, which is leadership. In different perspectives, we've all got different perspectives of leadership here. But It takes a special kind of person to do this kind of work. And we're growing that understanding. Steve's been in the seat for a long time. Um, some of us are getting in it or getting out of it. Um, we had a lot, everybody had a chance, I hope, to hear Dr. Everett's comments about your identity is, understanding your own identity is key to understanding how to lead in teams like these, programs like these. Um, Comments about leadership, comments about the growing need for leadership in mobile programs.
I'm really enjoying getting the technical expertise and learning a bit more about the nuts and bolts of leadership in crisis response and alternative response. But it really does, I think about it as an internal practice. We have these technical skills, but how do we employ them? How do we employ them strategically and with empathy and in a way that continues to move toward the goals of equity and safety that you all aspire to? And I'm very interested in hearing about the ways that you all think beyond the technical expertise. Well, not a beyond it, alongside the technical expertise of what sort of mindsets are necessary and what sort of skills are needed in order to usher these programs along.
Steve, I'm going to tap you.
Sure. Boy, we need leadership out there, especially with the teams. I go to the, CIT conferences. I go to many conferences, and the mobile teams, they're very proud people of, what they're doing. And I'm always asking, how are you doing it, and how do you know? How do you know you're doing something good, and what are you really measuring? What's that look like? And you don't always get the full buy-in, from all the leadership. You don't get that feeling like, wow, they really love what they're doing. They're really invested in what they're doing. And as I've gotten older, I've gotten more critical. I'm like, wow, I mean, then get out. If you're really not enjoying what you're doing and making a difference in people's lives, please get out. Give somebody a chance to come in here and have that energy to do the right things. So I'm critical of leadership often, but when I find, like within my own agency, we're looking at the leadership coming up because I'm not going to be here forever, and so that's the mentoring and the investing in your teams to become those leaders, and to learn even more as they're evolving, because I still think mobile teams are evolving. We have so many different definitions of what mobile teams and the makeup of mobile teams and things that are out there. It's just an evolution that we have to pay attention to. Leadership would pay attention to that. If you're just a typical provider running a mobile team, you're not going to pay attention, and your team's not going to evolve. It's not going to get better at what they do. And so there's not enough that can be said about leadership in not just mobile teams, but behavioral health itself. And I think it's on us, that those of us that are a little wiser and have learned so much from, and I've made a lot of mistakes, and I learned from every mistake. I never just made a mistake and said, "Oh, I'll try it again." I look at it. I look at the root cause. I really try to figure out, how can we do this better? And that's the leadership that we need, especially in mobile teams. Mobile teams. I can't talk enough about how magical they can be. When you can reply within 7 minutes and get your team out there and engage and really, listen and be invested in that person that's having that challenge. That to me is the epitome of what a team can do.
Jennifer asked a question in the chat about burnout. It's a 24/7 position, she says. This is not outpatient care. This is not waiting for people to come in and have their 3:30 appointment on Thursday afternoon. This is a 3:30 in the morning appointment in someone's parking lot and it's raining.
Or snowing.
What's
Um,
your prescription for reducing burnout?
yeah, it is resilience, but it's also, I mentioned earlier when I spoke today, we have a wellness committee within our organization. And we also have open lines of communication. I mean, my staff can email me or call me at any point, and in the day, if they're having a hard time, I don't want them to have a hard time. My leadership team doesn't want them to have a hard time. So we're all on the same page in the organization to say we're going to support this team, the best we can. And we've done that. We continue to do that. And we don't always get it right. It's not 100%. But if somebody's not telling you that they're burning out and they're just kind of trotting along, we're going to see it in performance. And that's going to help have us, then approach them and say, what's happening here? How can we help? Do you need to move to another department for now or whatever? But we'll look at that and we'll make those adjustments, as we're learning, what's happening. But resilience, and then I keep going back to the lived experiences. My staff, my teams, they don't forget where they came from, and that's so energizing when they can, you know, help others, beyond what they have been through. It's was it helped people help people? And that's such a true statement with in a peer-run organization at the very least.
I think it's also important to get curious about those opportunities for past resilience. What happened right before the burnout? Like, what were the early signs that this was coming? And what can we do to disrupt that? If I start to notice that when I'm stressed, I eat less. So when I notice that I'm eating less, then get in front of it before it becomes a full-on crash out. And it's important for us to know those things about ourselves, but it's also important for us to invest in knowing those things about the people that we work with. Thinking about what signs you may notice in your team, excuse me, as you're seeing these things and being able to ask questions and get curious and really read the dynamics of the team that you're working with.
Yeah, here's a novel concept that we did years ago, and we got involved with Mary Ellen Copeland and the Wellness Recovery Action Plan, which, if you don't know that, it's a plan that helps you to stay well. So it understands when things are starting to turn for you. What does that look like? Well, like you said, you might eat less, your humor might go away, you might be more irritable. Okay, something. So then you move, you turn your page and say, well, what helps me get back into that wellness state? And you can do that. And so for a while, when I first started doing it, I became a rap facilitator. I said, can you do this with an organization, I wonder? And I was small enough back then I could do it where we actually had a rap plan for the organization. How do we show up? How's the attendance? How's the humor? How's the outcomes, the work that we're doing? What's it looking like? Now what we're moving into and we're just starting is rap plans for the teams themselves. So it doesn't have to be an agency rap plan, but how does the team know it's doing well? And that's we're moving into that so that we can at least look at that resilience and head it off before it gets to that critical level.
Well, great article Therese has put into the chat on burnout in alternative response programs. That's great to have. Thank you. Clay, Beethoven, you've got some thoughts here.
Something that I think about a lot in terms of burnout is talking to my staff and being curious. If I notice something is wrong, I'm going to pull you into my office. We're going to talk about it. We can shelf it if we need to, but at some point it needs to be addressed. And that's not just for my supervisees, but that's for the whole crisis team. If I notice someone is not okay, I'm going to pull them into my office and ask them what's going on. People need a place to talk. People need a place to talk safely about the really horrible things that can happen in this work and how that's affecting them. And I think that, especially as a peer supervisor, but just as a peer and a person with lived experience, we need to be able to sit our supervisees down as we would any peer relationship and be like, okay, let's go over the 8 dimensions of wellness if you don't even know what's going on right now. We can break it all the way down because I'm noticing there's a change in you and I want you to be okay and I want us to be able to have the best possible outcome for this team. And you're a big part of the team.
And Beethoven, do you ask permission to do this? This is as we were speaking earlier in
Oh
the day. This is
yeah,
very
of course.
intrusive.
Yeah.
So how do you frame this conversation long before it happens?
I'll just walk up to somebody and be like, hey, do you mind if I check in with you? I'm noticing something's up. Do you mind if we check in? And if we
Hmm.
can't check in now, do you want to check in later at some point?
Hmm.
And privately away from the room because our whole office is one big room, but I they know what to expect from me as well, that I'm well-meaning. And if someone doesn't want to talk to me, I'm not offended by that, you know.
You two do the good cop, bad cop thing.
We're both good cop.
Guilty.
No, yeah,
Oh yeah.
maybe. I will say, it's all about setting this intention from the beginning, and it's about being a peer ourselves. And, no one is ever surprised if I'm asking them how they're doing because I talk about how I'm doing. And I try to be, I'm professional, but I'm also very transparent about things. My mom broke her foot recently, and I told people about that. Like, hey, I got to take some time off. I got to go do this. I got to go help her out with this thing. And wow, it's really stressful having to worry about her while I'm also dealing with these things. And like by dropping little tidbits, I'm not oversharing, but I drop little tidbits about things that go on in my personal life so that people know that they can do that with themselves. Well, with their supervisor, with the team. But I want to think about this from the leadership perspective too, because when you first asked this question, we're talking about like how do we deal with that as leaders that are, dealing with those 3:30 in the morning calls, and it's really about supporting each other, and I think that's just so key. We make the norm that it's okay to be intentional about self-care. When I need time, I take time, and Beethoven can cover those things for me, or my supervisor, Jackie, can cover those things for me. And I don't check my phone when I'm on PTO. I take time off and I tell people I'm taking time off and I make sure the team knows that I'm doing that. And I'm really intentional about those things because if we as leaders are intentional about doing that and sharing that, then our teams are more comfortable doing that. We hear all the time, especially in on the mobile crisis team, oh gosh, I don't want to take tomorrow off because I know we're already short staffed and like if people will be, I'll be letting the team down, and share all the time. Like there's always another crisis. Like there will always be another call. The need will always outweigh the resources, and so we have to stop and take care of ourselves when we need to do that. And because if we don't, then we're not going to be able to do this work sustainably. And I think that's one of the reasons that our team is working in a sustainable way is that we really allow for that. And like, if you need to call out tomorrow, that's okay, and we'll figure it out. We'll deal because you have to be able to take care of yourself, and you also have to be able to laugh. That's the last thing I'll say on this. I make mistakes all the time, and I laugh at myself, and Beethoven laughs at me, and we laugh at each other. And if we couldn't do that, this would not feel as sustainable. So.
And
Well,
just
part of
to
this
add
is
on, oh, I just wanted to say our team is very close. We're very close people. We're close with each other. The team hangs out with each other outside of work. We have a real rapport built within our team structure.
so you're both remaining professional and unprofessional.
Yes.
Authentic is the way I like to
Authentic
think it.
or human, even.
Yes.
Oh,
And I
it's
ask for feedback. I'm always asking my team for feedback. If I'm being too much, I will be like, tell me, please let me know how I can actually support you in a way that feels safe, in a way that feels supportive to you in reality, and in a way that's going to help you thrive in this position and further in your career.
that quality of authenticity doesn't come, strangely enough, often doesn't come naturally to folks. Or maybe something happens to them and they have to be fake.
It's really the way that leadership broadly is constructed and what behaviors are rewarded in leaders. The idea of decisiveness, objectivity, distance from the problem, or professionalism, in air quotes, with whatever that means, are the reasons why those things, I won't say they don't come naturally, but they have kind of been beat out of us by the time we get to the leadership space. And that's one of the things that the participants in the cohort shared, is that they stopped leaning on skills that lived outside of those models, and instead foregrounded the behaviors that seem to be privileged more.
Well, thanks, everyone. It's been a great discussion. Thanks for participating in this conference.